So we are finishing this series on Habakkuk, and it's been entitled Frustrated with God. And this is a picture of Christianity. If you did not grow up in the church and you have this idea of what a Christian is, maybe it's a little bit like, Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, where everything is, this walk in the park and everything is fine, and whatever happens, you're okay with it. And the reality is if you've lived long enough, you face real hardship. Even for someone like Gary and Minji, who have prepared to go into full-time vocational ministry, and some kind of freak accident happens, you can't help but wonder, God, why? God, why? And for Gary and Minji, they are learning this journey of Habakkuk. And Habakkuk, he questions God's silence in the beginning. God, how long will you stay quiet? Questions God's inactivity. God, how long will you be idle? And then in these passages, everything turns, because he calls his own words complaints. And in the Hebrew, it's actually more of a rebuke. That's how angry he is with God. And he's a prophet. And what we see here is his situation has not changed. His circumstances are still the same. He doesn't really have that many more answers, but somehow, some way, in the midst of hardship and suffering, he's able to rejoice. And that's amazing. Because if you've gone through any kind of hardship, for us, going to the subway and missing that subway makes us angry. So little things like that. Imagine when you know that your own people will endure suffering. How do you handle that? And if you don't understand how to handle suffering, it'll impact you. You see, hardship in whichever shape or form, it's going to impact you one way or another. If you aren't ready for it, it's going to make you bitter. It's going to make you cold. You'll become like that old, grumpy old man that you thought of when you were young, wondering, why are they all so grumpy? The reason the reason older people are so grumpy is because they've endured hardship and there's been no outlet. They don't know how to process it. Or the other is somehow through the suffering, you're made stronger. Somehow through the suffering, you're actually made stronger, yet compassionate and tender. And I think of other people who are older, who have this wealth of wisdom. But even more than that, they have this steadiness in life. Whatever happens, they seem to be secure. And that's what we're hoping for. Learning from Habakkuk, how do we, through all the hardship and suffering, learn to endure in such a way that it makes us stronger, tender, and through it you can learn to rejoice. So that's what we're looking into. How do we rejoice in hardship and suffering? First, it's to humbly trust God. Tell your neighbor, humbly trust God. Humbly trust God. It seems so cliche, so obvious. When you go through hard times, humbly trust God. But I want you to see it here, and I hope that you can start to feel it even within your heart. In verse 1, it's a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to the Shigionoth, right? It's a word that helps you understand that it was a type of song. The whole idea of this is he was talking to God the whole time, right? It was a prayer the whole time. But what's changed? It's not his circumstances. It's him. It's him that has changed. All of this is a prayer. It's he who has changed. And then in verse 2, you start to see why. O Lord, I have heard the report of you. Again, their circumstances have not changed. He has not seen God work. That's what that's saying. Because it should say, if he's seeing God work, God, I've seen you work. But he says, I've heard the report of you, which is like many of us. We are going through some hardship. We've prayed and prayed and prayed, and we haven't seen God answer. And so you wish you could have that testimony to be able to share with you, this is how I've seen God work, but in certain areas of your life you haven't seen. All you have are reports. Continues on. I have heard the report of you and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. And then you can tell that he's totally changed because of this last line. In wrath, remember mercy. Because the whole time, in the chapter before, God was addressing Habakkuk and his inability to handle God's judgment. And so now he has come full circle, and he's now able to say, God, if you will bring your judgment, if you will bring your wrath, do so, but remember mercy. So he's come to a totally different place. And the question is, what's happened since chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3? What's happened if the circumstances have not changed? If God has not changed, then what changed? Habakkuk changed. He's actually endured something. He's actually learned something in the past 2 chapters. Because in all of chapter 2, God was showing to him, if you think I don't care about judgment and justice, let me show you how much I care about justice. And he lays it out in such a way that it gives you satisfaction. Satisfaction knowing that the bad people get just punishment. The punishment is fitting and right. And that's what has happened in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, the key verse of Habakkuk, I believe. It's, behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright with him. The righteous shall live by faith. You see how he's changed is before he was proud, and now he is humble. His soul is not puffed up. God has not changed. The situation has not changed. He has changed. He has become humble. What he thought, the reason he thought he couldn't trust God was because of his circumstance. He thought he couldn't trust God because of what he knew was happening all around him. And he felt like the circumstances were so dire, so bad, so not just, that he felt like he could take the evidence that he sees before him and accuse God, God, you are not good, God, you are not just. And what basically chapter 2 is all about is God putting Habakkuk in his place and saying, if you think these things define who I am, let me show you what you don't see, and lays before him all the ways he cares about justice so much more than Habakkuk. You see, it's not the circumstances in our lives that determine whether God is just or not. Because if we're able to see from God's perspective, at the end of it all of us would say, God is good and God is just. But we can't comprehend it. Travis Scott, an author and pastor of Habakkuk, of a book of Habakkuk, says it this way: the opposite of faith isn't doubt, but pride. The opposite of faith isn't doubt, but pride. And that's exactly what has happened to Habakkuk. God did not change, circumstances did not change, he has changed, he has become humble. And not because he has some humility, he now can have faith to know that God is doing something good and just. He just can't comprehend it. He has been humbled. This is such a common understanding that even Hollywood knows this principle. That the reason we don't have faith is not because that our circumstances are so dire. The reason we don't have faith is because of our pride. And why do I say Hollywood understands this? Because they made a whole movie about it. Bruce Almighty. Who has seen Bruce Almighty? It's actually quite good. I mean, granted, very theologically off at times. But it does a great job actually communicating this point. Bruce, played by Jim Carrey, wants a promotion, and he gets angry when he doesn't get the promotion. And it leads to him becoming, as I mentioned before, that suffering, that hardship, leads him to become angry, bitter, and he just struggles with all these bad decisions that he makes. And he's so frustrated in life that he accuses God of this. He says, God, you're the one that should be fired, because he got fired from his job of doing so badly. He's so angry, saying, God, you're the one that should be fired from your job. And so, as Hollywood does so well, she portrays what it would look like for then Bruce, Jim Carrey, to have this power of God. And so Morgan Freeman, who always plays God in all Hollywood movies, goes to Jim Carrey and says, you can have the powers of God for 1 week. Let's see how you do. And so he uses, Bruce, Jim Carrey, uses all the powers to get what he wants. So he gets his job back. He tries to get the girl that he loves. And in that, he miserably fails and ruins everything in his own life. And so he's frustrated again. And then God tells him, why don't you try to use your powers that I gave you to do some good? Stop living for yourself and stop helping others. So he thought, okay, I'll try to do that. And then he starts to hear all these voices in his head. He's like, what are these voices? What are these voices? And then God tells him, these are prayers. He's like, how do you listen to all these people? How do you hear them and answer their prayers? God's basically telling Jim Carrey, figure out how to answer prayers. So then you see all these images of him, okay, all these voices, I need to figure out how to organize it. So he gets a filing cabinet system, organizing it. And the next thing you know, he's in a room full of filing cabinets. He's like, I can't do it this way. So he thinks, oh, Post-its. Next thing you know, the whole room is filled with Post-its. Like, I can't do this. He's like, oh, aha. I'll create a digital system called InstaPrayer. InstaPrayer, he develops it, and it's basically this emailing system. You just see him going crazy, responding to all these emails. And then he finishes the 1.5 million prayers that he received in that moment. He's like, it's not so bad. Not so bad to play God. As soon as he finishes, 3 million more prayers come. And he's like, oh my gosh. And as he's typing away, he's thinking, I have a better idea. You know what? I'll just make everybody happy. And I'll reply yes to all. Yes to all. He's done. Right? And then he finds out those are just the prayers of the people in the Buffalo area. All God has given him is the ability to have this power of God just in the Buffalo area. It was in that you start to see in the next scenes what happens when you say yes to everybody. You see a guy saying, I got rich through the stock market. You see a grown man saying, I got taller. God answered that prayer of me getting taller. And you see all of this, and basically a week passes, and then there's rioting. Right? Everybody's angry. All like the 100 or so people who won the lottery gets nothing. And at the end of it, as Jim Carrey plays God, he doesn't get his life worked out, and he ruins everybody else's life. And you see him, and then, it's raining at that time. He's walking down the street, and then he says these words, you win, God. I'm done. Please. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be God. I want you to decide what's right for me. I surrender to your will. And you're like, oh, Hollywood, good job. Because it's exactly the lesson of Habakkuk. God, why this? God, why that? God, because I can't understand this, you must be wrong. And it's in that, through a story like Bruce Almighty, we recognize even as Jim Carrey tries to play God just in this Buffalo area, he has not enough wisdom. He doesn't know what is right or good, and in his endeavor in doing so, he ruins everything. Do you know how you can learn to trust God in hardship and circumstance and suffering? The way that you trust him is you learn to trust God when you realize that you would be a horrible God. It's like, becoming a parent. We always have these critiques of our parents, and we become parents, we're like, oh man, like my parents are actually pretty good. It's like becoming that boss, right? When I get to that position, I'm going to do it so well. You become the boss, and all these people have complaints against you, and you realize, oh, I actually am not that much better than the previous bosses that I had. Right? That's the idea. We judge God thinking, God, if I was you, I wouldn't do it this way. And Habakkuk, at the end of it, realizes God is wiser and more just, good, better, gracious, loving than he could ever be. And that's why at this point he can say, as hard as these words are, even in your wrath, God, remember mercy. Because I don't understand how it all works out, but now he understands to humbly trust God. You see, in verse 16, we see something similar. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble. He doesn't have all the answers, and you have to understand that. You'll go through hardships in life, and you'll want answers. And the reality is, as my seminary professor said, that there'll be great injustices and hardship that you go through in life that you'll never find out the reason why it happened. Are you going to be okay with that? And that's Habakkuk. He quietly waits. What's he waiting for? He's waiting for the judgment of his own people. Before, he was so angry at God because he was one of them. Now, even though he's just as sympathetic, he's still one of them. He says, God, if this is the way, then let it be. But in your wrath, please remember mercy. It's a humble prayer. Verses 17, you see this continue on. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no fruit. It's talking about a famine. It's talking about this day of destruction when they have nothing. There will be no herds in the stalls. What does he say? Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. It's not because he's so noble. It's because he has been humbled and he recognizes God is God and he is not. You see, many people think that faith and doubt can't coexist. That's not true. You see, it's not faith and doubt that can't coexist. It's faith and pride that can't coexist. You see, the smartest people that I know, a lot of them are men and women of faith. What you recognize is that there are brilliant Christians and there's brilliant atheists and agnostics. What separates them, I think, is a sense of Christians saying, there are things that I can't explain. And it relieves room for faith. You see, what Habakkuk teaches us is that the proud, they don't go to God because of all these assumptions that they have. The reason they don't go to God is because of the pride, not the situation. But the humble, even with their doubts, questions, and complaints, always go to God. And so whatever thing that you're going through, to understand that though you don't have the answers, humble faith says, I'll go to God. I don't understand. I wish it was different, but I'll go to God because that sense of humility. I don't understand, but I trust him. The pride, they don't go to God. They say there is no room for God's explanation because they think they know enough and they know all. The humble, they allow God to be God. You see, it's a humble trust, but also it's very intentional. It's an intentional remembrance of who God is. And that's what most of all this chapter is about. You see, he humbly trusts. And how does he do that? How do you learn to trust God? You don't just simply conjure up faith. The way in which you humbly trust God is you intentionally remember what God has done and what he is doing. So for 14 verses, if you were, as Anne was reading, you just didn't understand what was going on. It was 14 verses of Habakkuk rehearsing the acts of God, the stories of God. Basically, what he is saying is, I don't know, I haven't experienced God in this way, but I know the reports. So he uses those reports. And that's what this is. Just to go quickly through it. Verse 3, God came from Teman. It's a reference to a place in Edom, but also a reference to the south. It's a reference to Egypt. Saying, God, this is when you first came into our people, the Israelites. God came from the south, the Holy One from Mount Paran, reference to the wilderness. So he goes back to the beginning of his people's journey with God and saying, God, I wish you were working right now in the ways that I want you to, but because I can't, because I don't have those experiences yet, those testimonies, I'll go back to the stories of old. God, you were the God who rescued your people from Egypt. That's what he's talking about. And then in verse 4, descriptions of Mount Sinai, right? His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Exodus 19 says the same exact things. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings, a thick cloud on the mountain, a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. What he is doing is he's learning to cultivate his faith, not by conjuring it up or generating it, saying, I'm going to believe, I'm going to believe, I'm going to believe. Not like that. He recounts God's faithfulness. As he does, as Romans says, faith comes by hearing. He hears. He puts himself in a position. He's humbled, and though he can't understand, he hears of God's work. Verse 7, talking about Cushan and Midian. Those are instances in the book of Judges. If you continue on, it changes from verse 8, where from verses before 8, it goes referencing God in the third person. Now he references God in the second person. You. It's direct now. You. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? All right, so now it's changed. It's getting even more personal. Do you see that? Continues on. You, O God, in verse 11, the sun and the moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear, talking about the incident in Joshua when he had the sun stop. He recounts all these miraculous stories of God, saying, God, I want to see this now. And I want to trust that you are there. And the only way that I can do that is by remembering what you have done. It's intentional remembering. This is what all Christians do. This is what all the people have always done. They've remembered of what God has done. One pastor was asked, what do you do when you struggle? This is what he said. He says, he reads biographies of men and women who have gone before him, Christian men and women. And he says, in those dry seasons, in those seasons of struggle, he goes to these biographies and reads about how God has worked in their life. Because for some reason, for all of us, we go through seasons where when God seems distant, not because of a certain sin or whatever it is, you just maybe are going through a hardship. Maybe God seems a bit far. And so what do? You read scripture. You remind yourself of who he is. You read stories of men and women who have gone before you. And through it, what you are doing is you're retelling your heart of God and who he is. Tim Keller, when he preaches on this text, he talks about the importance of understanding what remembering really is. He says the whole idea of remembering, and this is maybe a little bit graphic, but it's the whole idea of when you cut your finger off, the idea is your finger has been dismembered. And he's saying when you are remembering something, you're reconnecting that dismembered part of your body back together. So your finger's been dismembered, and you are remembering that finger. And what he's saying about biblical remembering is you're connecting what you know of God in your mind through stories so that you can connect him to your heart. Remembering is reconnecting what you know of God in your mind through confessions and stories in your heart. You have to learn to do that. If you don't know how to do that, you will always let your circumstances and also your emotions dictate whether God is good or not. But if you could humble yourself and learn this practice to remember God, how? By connecting your mind to your heart through confessions and stories. And when you think about that paradigm of how to cultivate faith, the Bible's filled with that. Right? Abraham creating altars. When he experiences God, he creates an altar. And it's always said, remember this. Jacob in Bethel creates this pillar to remember this dream that he had. All the people of the Bible do all these different physical things to remember what God has done. But maybe the clearest example is how we're supposed to actually share our faith. It's in the same way. You share your faith not by just telling people God is good and all these apologetics. The best way to share your faith is to share your story. Deuteronomy says it this way: when your children ask about why you believe, why we do all these things as Israelites, the response is in verse 21 of chapter 6. Then you shall say to your son, and this is what they say, what you're told to say. We were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt. It's a story. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders, great and grievous, against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his households before our eyes. And it continues on, and in verse 24 it says, and the Lord commanded us to do these statutes. When your son asks, when your children ask, what is your faith about? Why do you go to church? You don't just say, oh, we worship God. Oh, this is what we do. No. Use that to share about who God is to you. And so if someone asks you, why do you go to church? What would you say? Do you know God and how He has worked in your life so clearly and so well that you just naturally tell stories? Why do you go to church? The reason I go to church, I know it sounds kind of crazy, is He changed my life. I used to struggle with anger. I used to struggle with deep loneliness and insecurity. That's why I go. God literally changed my life, right? Obviously, you have to know when to share something like that, but with a close friend, if they was to ask you, why do you go to church? Do you know how God has worked in your life in such a way that every time you think about that, you have faith? Faith is cultivated within you. You see, you have to humbly trust. How do you do that? You intentionally remember. And lastly, you deeply sing. You deeply sing to God. In verse 1, the prayer of Habakkuk, according to the Shigionoth, that's a musical term. No one really knows what it means, but they know it's a musical reference. And then in verses 3, 9, and 13, you see the word Selah. Right? You've seen it in the Psalms. It's these musical markers. In verse 17, at the end of it, it's to the choir master. This, I think, is so beautiful, and I believe so caring and even what I would say shepherding of God. You see, because God knows the issue at hand is not a mind issue. He knows it's a heart issue. The reason we hate injustice, yes, it's because we can't comprehend it in our minds. But issues of injustice are issues of the heart, are they not? We get angry when we hear about such injustices. And what's God doing? He's not giving us a theological dissertation about explaining evil and explaining good and what He is doing. He doesn't do that. Probably because we can't comprehend it, but also, too, because sin is it never made sense. From the beginning, it never made sense. What God is doing in His wisdom and grace is not giving us a theological dissertation of what is happening. He gives us a song. He gives you a song to sing in that night when you have so many questions, when all you have is anger. What does He give you? He teaches you sing. Because you know why, but you don't know why. So He teaches you sing. Sing deeply. And as you do, what it does is it opens up your heart. Nothing changes. God doesn't change. Your circumstance doesn't change. But what changes when you sing? You change. Right? Why are so many songs about love? Is it because by words we can't communicate what love is? Partially, because the way that you want to communicate love is through song. Because that's heart language. And that's what it's talking about. You see, Job's friends were miserable comforters, and God is not. God says, I know you're struggling. I know you don't understand. And so sing. And what happens when you sing? What happens when you sing is you make what you know of God in your mind, in your heart, as you sing. St. Augustine said, he who sings, prays twice. Right? I can tell you God is good, but you can sing God is good. And it's a ministry to your soul, to your heart. You see, the last thing that he gives Habakkuk is not a promise that everything's going to be okay. You see, the very end is a famine is coming, judgment is coming. And he says, so learn to sing. You have to learn to sing. In Psalm 73, as this psalmist was struggling, he didn't understand God until he came into the sanctuary. And he says, but when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task until I went to the sanctuary of God. Then I discerned their end. He didn't learn anything. But as he came to a sanctuary, as he heard the other people of God sing, faith welled up within him. I mean, I'm sure there's many of you were struggling, and it was before the sermon, right? It was through the songs it ministered to you. I can't tell you how many times it was through congregational singing that my heart was ministered to. Nothing changed, my heart changed. How beautiful is this? In Hebrews, it talks about God singing in the midst of the congregation. The idea is, for Habakkuk, as he anticipates the hardest things to come, God tells him, learn to sing. And then in Hebrews, I think we understand why. Because it's the God who once suffered stands in the midst of his people to sing with us. Hebrews 2 says, for it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering, talking about Christ. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source, which is Christ. This is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers. Jesus is our elder brother, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. The idea is, as we know we live in this broken world, as we know that tomorrow may be a bad day, the promise is not everything is going to be okay tomorrow. The promise is, as you sing, the one who knows suffering sings with you. That he knows and he comforts you and he'll give you strength through song. Let's pray.